Good afternoon. The passage before the sermon comes from James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. May God bless the reading and preaching of his word. Amen. Please be seated. Over the past few weeks, we've been discussing the disproportionate power of words. How the tongue is a fire, as James says, which can either purify a forest or burn it to the ground. And that one form which destructive speech takes is boasting. For example, James chides his audience in chapter 2, saying, you boast in your belief in God, well, good for you. Even the demons believe. What you ought rather to have done is demonstrate the validity of your confession through good deeds, in particular works of mercy and justice. And the same is true for those aspiring leaders who boast in their wisdom and understanding, says James in chapter 3. Instead, they should manifest such virtues by their works. Now, one of the things that's interesting about these two examples of boasting is that there is actually nothing wrong with the expressions in and of themselves. For it's not wrong, of course, to simply profess one's faith, nor would it be wrong to put oneself forward for church leadership because you believe you meet the qualifications. In fact, both of these forms of speech are commended in Scripture. They are given as examples of pious utterance, one of which is even mandatory. Now, what makes these particular statements impious is that they are false. Lying against the truth, as James says earlier in chapter 3, verse 14, is a form of boasting because it is rooted in arrogance. Indeed, lying is the most arrogant thing that you can do, according to Romans chapter 1. To contradict what is obviously the case is the very height of hubris, says Paul. And so when you lie, you might, your conscious motivation might be not arrogance, but fear, in fact. You might be afraid of the consequences of telling the truth in this given situation. But nonetheless, to think that you can speak against the truth, that requires maximal conceit. And so to lie is to boast. Now, in this case, the lie has taken the form, in these two sections, in chapter 2 and chapter 3, it's taken the form of a misrepresentation. These individuals are claiming to be something that they are not. They are hypocrites. They are wearers of masks, is what the word means. They are actors who cover their true identity. And James is calling on them to remove the pretense and expose themselves to the glaring reflection of reality, to a face-to-face encounter with the truth of their inadequacies, their imperfections, so that they might stop pretending and start practicing true and undefiled religion. And so that's his exhortation. As we said, we keep going back to that exhortation in chapter 4, but that's central to the text. But having said that, it's important to also note, I think, concerning hypocrisy, this might sound crazy, that hypocrisy is not all bad. It's bad, but it's not all bad. As Christians, we tend to think of it in rather stark terms, as the deadly disease which plagued the scribes and Pharisees, and which therefore must be purged from the Christian body and soul. And for good reason, we fear it and despise it, because as James warns in this text, the double-minded man will not receive anything from the Lord. But as surprising as it may sound, there is a kind of noble farce, as we might call it, a virtuous pretending, which plays an essential role in our moral formation, where the simulacrum of virtue, which is to say, the mere appearance of it, is more honorable than no virtue at all. C.S. Lewis, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, it's a book, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. But in his autobiography, he tells of a young soldier that he met during the war who was also a scholar at Oxford, but who possessed something that Lewis himself lacked, a conscience. And Lewis was embarrassed by this contrast, and so he did his best to conceal his lack of character, which was a hypocrisy which he came to realize eventually actually did him some good. He writes this: to be ashamed of what you were about to say, to pretend that something you had meant seriously was only a joke, that is an ignoble part. But it is better than not to be ashamed at all. And the distinction between pretending you are better than you are and beginning to be better in reality is finer than moral sleuthhounds conceive. When a boor first enters the society of courteous people, what can he do for a while except imitate the motions? How can he learn except by imitation? Regeneration, as Lewis notes, doesn't lead immediately to sanctification, nor does immersion to moral rectitude. And the only thing open to the neophyte in this kind of liminal space, to the new convert in this transition, as Lewis says, is imitation. To go through the moral motions of the Christian life, to fake it until he makes it. A transition which is incremental and often imperceptible, where one day you just realize that your actions are no longer mere pretension, but pure religion. And it's a progression the devil knows all too well, and thus why he labors to hinder our progress in it, hoping to persuade us that artificial piety is just as precious as the real thing, that religiosity is the same as religion, something that he's convinced many people of. And it's really an impressive sort of feat of salesmanship, you might say, convincing us to give up the infinite for the finite, or the substance for the shadow. This week I saw a Far Side cartoon. It was the image of a man pulling up in a boat to a community of Eskimos, each of which had a refrigerator outside of his igloo. And the caption read, "Ralph Harrison, King of Salesmen." Which, the more I thought about it, is a strange thing to admire, isn't it? That skill. The ability to sell ice to Eskimos, as they say, which is really just persuading people to spend their precious resources on that which is worthless, which is something that the devil does. And I think it's just another reflection of the shift that we've discussed before, this shift that we've seen in our culture from commerce being driven ultimately by the common good to it being driven by the individual good. But speaking of commerce, that helps segue us nicely into the third kind of boasting that James mentions in this letter. This time it concerns speech about the future, the making of plans, and the prediction of success in commercial trade. Verse 13 of chapter 4 again says, "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit.'" Now, this scenario that's painted here by James would have been very familiar to his audience. I don't think most people realize this, but at this time, there was really a robust commercial trade. There was much commercial activity that was taking place, and it was one in which the Jews were particularly active. Many would leave Palestine and venture out into various parts of the Mediterranean world seeking financial prosperity, or at least stability. It was sort of the rise of the merchant class. But again, we note that this particular expression, this idea of going out and making plans, is in and of itself not sinful. In fact, you can find similar statements among the prophets and apostles in Scripture. The problem, once again, is the attitude which underlies the utterance. Because in making such plans, James says, these individuals boast and brag, as one translation puts it. Or as the Phillips translation has it, and this is perhaps the best capturing of the sense of it. It says, you get a certain pride in yourself in planning your future with such confidence. And so it seems that past successes have stirred within these merchants a distorted trust in their own competence, which is revealing itself in their speech. It's a presumptuousness which leaves God out entirely from their planning and their expectations of success. In other words, they're failing to give credit to whom credit is due. And of course, this is something that I think we do, at least I know that I do way too often. How often do I fail to take God into account when I'm engaged in my almost perpetual scheming of what it is that I'm going to do? At least I keep him out of it until something goes wrong with the plan, right? I seem to be perfectly fine with Jesus fixing my plan when it goes awry, but not in formulating it. Which, it seems to me it's kind of like a captain who ignores the battle plans of his general and he goes his own way because he thinks he knows better, and then, of course, he cries out for rescue once he's in peril. I think we do something similar very often with our planning. And again, at the heart of this kind of arrogance, notice, is the rejection of reality. There's a failure to see our own inadequacies. One of the central themes of the Bible is that man may think he is in control of his destiny, but he is not. That's just an illusion. God is in control. Proverbs 16:9 says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." Or again, Proverbs 19:21, "Many plans are in a man's heart, but the purpose of the Lord will prevail." Or as Rick just read for us from Jeremiah 10:23, "I know, O Lord, that a man's way is not his own. No one who walks directs his own steps." So the future of man, the future of your destiny, lies in the hands of God, not in your hands. And that's a good thing. I mean, imagine if we really were the masters of our own fate, as our culture tells us that we are, if we were the captains of our own destiny. We who don't even know what tomorrow will bring, as James reminds us, quoting Proverbs 27. And who, even if we could predict the future, lack the power to do anything about it. It's almost a mercy that we don't know what's going to happen. Because if we knew everything that was going to happen, we couldn't do anything about it as it is. I mean, living in the modern world now, with the internet and the information age, we already know too much, right? There's already too much going on in the world. We start to almost get a sense of a godlike perspective, of knowing everything that's happening, every tribulation, every difficulty, every person who is suffering. We are not designed to take in that much information and to deal with it. Not only to be able to process it, but it just leads to frustration because we can do nothing about it. And so it's a blessing in a way that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow because we couldn't do anything about it anyway. No, as James says, we are but a mist, right, which appears for a little while and then vanishes. And imagine this for a moment, the way he sets this up. Imagine the morning dew, okay, which in the grand narrative of redemption is sort of a set piece. Right? We're like dew, he says. So imagine if the morning dew believed that it itself was the author of human history. Right? This dew which is here for a moment and then gone. Right? It would be the very crest of conceit. That's what he's saying is true of us when we think we can make these plans apart from God. And it reminds me, there's a similar kind of hubris that's present in people who reject God, those who are atheists, and therefore they reject God as the foundation of all objective moral values and duties. Because when you ask them, well, then, if you believe that, what then makes something like murder wrong? Because they lack an objective standard, eventually you will get them to admit that they just don't like murder. That's why they think it's wrong. They just think it's like, gross or bad. They just don't like it. Meaning that they ground morality in their own preferences, all the while failing to see how audacious this is, especially when they turn around and then they want you to conform to what is their preference. This is like forcing someone to confess that chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla. It's like the definition of tyranny. So on the one hand, they want to say, oh, I'm really, tolerant and all of that, but they want to bind upon you things that are their preferences. And here's another thing. If you are the ultimate ground for good and evil, then what was good and evil before you came into existence? And what will it be once you enter into oblivion? And so to claim that you are the ultimate standard of morality is woefully ignorant. And the same is true for those who boast that they are in control of the future. When the truth is that you will only accomplish that which the Lord allows you to accomplish. And I don't care if you're a Christian or not a Christian. This is true for everyone. You will only accomplish in the future that which Christ permits. It's like when Jesus said to Pilate, you have no authority other than that which my Father has given you. Well, you have no future other than that which the Father permits. Therefore, you should say, as James does, if the Lord wills, we will live, and we can go and do such and such. Your very life, the next breath of air you take, is in the hands of your Creator. It's His decision whether you continue to live or not. He not only created all things, but He sustains everything in its existence. At any moment, He could come and say, your life is required of you. It's done. It's over. You are utterly dependent upon Him for every breath that you take. And so if the Lord wills, we will live and we will go doing such and such. Anything short of that kind of mentality, and you boast in your arrogance, says James. Now, this text also bears witness to the finitude of our life, which since turning 50 has really pressed itself upon me, I will admit. It's such a cliche, I know, but there's something about the number 50. I guess probably because it used to sound so old to me. It sounded so near death. I saw a birthday card. I'm glad no one gave this to me, but I saw a birthday card. It's got the Apostle Peter on it, and it reads, Happy 50th birthday. See you soon. I don't think that's funny. But here's the truth. The truth is we will all see Peter soon. Every one of us. In the grand scheme of things, our life is but a twinkle in the night sky. One that will soon disappear, never to be seen again. Do we really understand this, I wonder? I don't think we do. Do we understand that our life is but a vapor, James says? That's the kind of statement that should stop you in your tracks. Your life is a vapor. You're here for a moment and then gone. You will soon vanish. And there is nothing you can do about it. Nothing. And so you can either accept this terrible truth, or you can suppress it in unrighteousness, pretending to be something that you're not. You can either face the cold reality of it, or you can turn your back upon it. But either way, the choice that you make will dramatically affect how you live out the rest of your days. As Christians, we are to live our lives in light of the coming kingdom, with absolute confidence and boldness, acknowledging that each moment on this earth, each breath could be our last, that each goodbye that we utter could be forever, that each promise to see you later might be an empty promise, that each sermon might be the last that I ever preach and the last you ever hear. This is why the Bible exhorts us time and again to speak the truth plainly while we have opportunity, and not to waste our speech in futile, vain boasting, speech which tears down God's kingdom, which deconstructs it. And so a question to ask yourself is, are you building with your speech, or are you tearing down? We cannot waste our words, because as Jesus says, we will give an account for every one of them. Let your words be constructive. Words that edify, as Paul would say, that build up. Now, the final thing to say about boasting, and I only have time really to introduce this, so the sermon might add in an unsatisfying way. But boasting, the truth is that it's sometimes necessary. Just as there's a good form of hypocrisy, there's a good form of boasting. Now, in the modern West, we have a real aversion to any form of self-praise. We have a gag reflex to it. But this was not the case in the ancient world. Now, while no one really appreciated arrogant boasting, the kind of self-aggrandizement, that puts other people down or is just consumed by arrogance that we mentioned, taking hold of the honor due one based upon your merit was perfectly acceptable in the Greco-Roman world. It was just taken for granted that those with great achievements would seek the praise which they had earned, even if they had to do the praising themselves. Such was viewed as a perfectly noble endeavor. Now, perhaps the best example of this kind of pursuit of praise comes in a document called The Achievements of the Divine Augustus. This is something the emperor wrote himself, the very early part of the first century, and he had it inscribed on bronze tablets that were then placed at the entrance of his mausoleum. And just to make sure that everybody got a chance to rejoice in his accomplishments, he had copies distributed throughout the empire. Now, we look at this and we just think, well, that would be ridiculous. But this really captures the Greco-Roman mindset when it comes to the importance of public honor, how much it was valued. And yet, really, until the era of Donald Trump, we might say, it would have, it'd be hard to imagine a public figure in the modern West so flush with self-congratulation. In fact, Donald Trump is sort of a stress test, we could say, for how much self-praise is acceptable. And it seems to be that we are still very much not accepting, not comfortable with much. But here's the thing, this was even true with the ancient Jews. You might think, well, those are the Romans. I mean, come on. But it was also true of the Jews. The opening words of Josephus' biography strike the modern reader, no doubt, as boastful. But again, no one would have batted an eye at this in the first century. Let me read to you just a portion of it. My family is not an ignoble one, tracing its descent far back to priestly ancestors. Different races base their claim to nobility on various grounds. With us, he's writing to Romans, a connection with the priesthood is the hallmark of an illustrious line. Not only, however, were my ancestors priests, but they belonged to the first of the 24 courses, a particular distinction, and to the most eminent of its constituent. Brought up with Matthias, my own brother, by both parents, I made great progress in my education, gaining a reputation for an excellent memory and understanding. While still a mere boy, about 14 years old, I won universal applause for my love of literature, insomuch that the chief priests and the leading men of the city used to constantly come to me for precise information on some particular notion in one of our ordinances. And on he goes like that. Try to strike that tone on the next cover letter you put out there and see how well it's received. Today we would be aghast if someone, however great they were, opened their autobiography with such self-praise. But again, this was the norm in antiquity for both the Jew and the Greek. Which is to say that there is a significant cultural difference between the ancient Mediterranean society and the modern Western world on this point. One which is a consequence, in large part, to the prohibitions that we find in the New Testament against boasting, like those in particular, James' epistle. However, I actually think that the devaluing of praise for human achievement that we find in the West today is based more upon a distortion of the biblical teaching, especially the biblical concept of humility, than a consistent outworking of it. Perhaps I think it's even a distortion of the gospel itself, because Christianity affirms the greatness of honor. We tend to have this picture where the Romans were all about honor. It's a shame-honor culture, and Christianity is about humility and, I guess, the elimination of all shame. That is utterly false. Christianity affirms the greatness of honor. It affirms the importance of human achievement. The reward of a good and faithful servant is the crown of glory. Glory and honor and peace to everyone who does good, to the Jew first and also the Greek, as Paul promises. Meaning that Christianity doesn't exalt humility for humility's sake. Right? The idea of sacrifice just for the sake of sacrifice, I think, is more Kantian than it is Christian. The lowering of oneself is not an end, but rather it's the means to true eternal exaltation. The humble are not left humbled, but will be lifted up, is the point. Because the cross didn't end the war, it simply began the revolution. We don't just experience a death, but a resurrection, an ascension, and a coronation as Christians. Which is to say that while Christ and his apostles redefined greatness, they didn't do so by making humility and honor mutually exclusive, which is often how it is taught today. In fact, I don't think there is anything anti-Christian in Josephus opening his autobiography by establishing his own credibility, as long as it's true. But we in the West have become so conditioned not to speak about our own accomplishments that we don't even feel comfortable doing so when it's necessary in like a job interview. Even the austere Apostle Paul engaged in boasting when the situation called for it. He wasn't boasting in his own salvation. It didn't come from arrogance, right? He was boasting in order to establish his credibility because his credibility was being challenged. Such self-promotion becomes hubris when the motive, as we said, for doing it is corrupt, when it comes from arrogance and conceit, from deception. Now, it is true that we all have a weakness for that kind of hubris, and therefore we should be careful when discussing our achievements, which is to say that in general, it's probably best to let others praise you, as it says in Proverbs 27. That should be our general rule. But there are times when a lack of boasting hinders the establishment of God's kingdom, when it actually hinders justice, when it prevents the cause of Christ. And so what I'm suggesting is a middle way, and like I said, I'm just introducing this, is totally unsatisfying. We can come back to it and look at some more examples. But what I'm suggesting is sort of a way to conclude this, is that there is a middle way here, that we can boast, but what we boast in has to be something that's truly righteous. And it has to come from a place of humility, a humble kind of boasting. So it's not arrogant boasting, which we discussed in the beginning, but it's also not arrogant self-deprecation, right? Which is a form, what do they usually call it? A humble brag. It's not a humble brag. It's not a proud brag. It's a kind of humble boasting, which is the middle course, which I think is the biblical view. So both of those coming together. So I'll just conclude by saying we have to be careful with our speech. We don't want to waste our words. We have to be careful with our boasting, but do so in righteousness. I thank you for your kind attention. Let's